All right, welcome back, everybody. Rick Holland, Chief Information Security Officer with Digital Shadows, here for part 2 of our interview with Bob Anderson from Cyber Defense Labs and our co-founder, James Chappell.
Hey.
Thanks for coming back again, although really you're not coming back because we're recording these back-to-back, but everybody knows that. So in the first part, we talked a lot about the breach headlines, and it wasn't FUD, it's reality, right? But for the second part, I thought what would be good for us to do is what can people do about it? What are steps that I think are practical that you could take into your programs today as security leaders, as business leaders? So Bob, we've been talking a little bit about boards. It came up in part 1. You know, maybe that's a good place to start off with is what do you advise boards to do to try to be proactive as much as they can to deal with the current crisis?
No, I think that's a great question. And some of the things I'm going to talk about, which I think is near and dear to every company, is anything that I talk about here in the next couple of minutes doesn't cost them a dime, right? Does not cost them a dime worth of money investment, but I don't see them doing it. First thing is, right, leadership starts at the top. So the CEO and the board needs to be engaged. They need to understand the risk to their company and where that risk lies. One of the things that we talk about at Cyber Defense Labs is integrating your cyber, your IT, and your physical security together. You don't hear a lot of companies talking about that, but we go back to data. And data is power because it's information of what's going on in and around your company. And I think you really, in this time frame, you need to be thinking about cyber, your data, your physical security, and your management access throughout your entire organization. The other thing is understanding the policies and procedures in and around a breach. I've brought it up before, but I can't say it enough. I think one of the biggest things, they need to have on call a firm that they trust that handles breaches from the legal side, that works in concert with the general counsel, the board, and the CEO when anything goes on. And then I think they also need to understand about their data. The reason I say that is, if I ask any CEO or board, where do you put your data? Most of them just say, in the cloud, right? I'm not so sure they understand that the cloud is really a server farm in Knoxville, Tennessee someplace, right? So when you say your data's there, how quick can you get a hold of it? Is it commingled with any other data? What's the retention policy on that? So that you actually understand when there's a breach or an interruption in your cyber or information security, or there's some type of an extortion attempt, how quickly can you get back up and running? I find, honestly, in real life breaches, no one really knows that. They think there's a certain area and they don't. And the last point I would bring up on that, and we talked about it a little bit, but the establishment of a chief risk officer. And what I mean by that, that's an officer in the company that really has visibility across every line in the organization and reports directly to the CEO or the board on what the determination of risk is across the company. I hear more and more boards and companies discussing that nowadays, and I honestly think that depending on the size and complexity of your company, having a trusted officer that his or her job is solely to look at potential risk is a big deal.
And that's way beyond, I guess a lot of the folks listening to this will be in an information security or cybersecurity type of role. And often when we say the word risk, we think of the cyber risk or the information security risk. But when you say CRO, Bob, you're really talking about true business risk, right?
I'm talking about true business risk, both in and around information security, IT, intellectual property, stacks of data within an organization, the reorganization or remaking of different hardware within the organization, how it fits into the big picture. I don't think enough of us look at it that way. And I call this a holistic approach, looking at an organization or a company, because it's so complex nowadays. And as we all know, business moves very quickly. So when you see large organizations that are running multiple business lines, none of those lines is waiting for the other line to do whatever they're going to do. But there needs to be somebody way up top looking at what's going on to the structure of these lines and saying, wait a minute, is that a risk to you or the entire organization? We can talk about third-party payroll, third-party HR. Everybody's outsourcing everything nowadays, right? So if I'm a bad guy or a bad gal, I don't need to break into your company anymore, right? I don't need, if you've got a hardened system and you've got a great information security, IT firewalls and all that stuff, you got stuff all over your system that's just high speed, low drag, and I can't get in, I'll go hit the third-party vendor and come in that way. Hardly anybody's talking about that. So when I say Chief Risk Officer, James, exactly what you said. It's somebody that's much bigger than just IT or information security.
I've really enjoyed some of this discussion around the shift to resilience as a concept as opposed to security. We use the word security to mean safe, free from harm. But resilience, brings in all those concepts like availability and, continuity of business and not losing money. If you're publicly listed, a loss of revenue is as catastrophic for your business as a loss of data, right? So I've sort of become, do you find yourselves talking about that resilience side more than just the sort of, keeping secrets?
No, actually, that's incorporated in our kind of look on risk on the proactive side. And what I always say is trust but verify. And here's what I mean by that. If everybody knows your data should be segmented, right? Everybody knows you should have redundancy data, right? Everybody. I can't tell you how many of these billion-dollar class action lawsuits that the heads of the company think, I got all that. And guess what? The answer is no. Right? So you have to trust but verify. At one time you might have had that, but your company's grown so much and the amount of data you actually hold, they ran out of that 18 months ago and they've not been doing any of that. And somewhere there's somebody trying to push a system up to you to get approval that it's never happened. So I think it's trust but verify when it comes to that. And especially in fast moving, larger companies or even smaller companies that have advanced technology, as we all know, AI and BI is just going off the charts when it comes to real corporate work, when it comes to BI and business interruption and business development things. So I think you need to make sure that you understand when somebody tells you, boss, this is what we've got, you trust, but you verify. I can guarantee if you and I sat here and had a conversation outside here and said, how many people did we go to and say, hey, do you guys test your backup data? Sure I do. And when you actually talk to the head IT, they haven't done it in 5 years, right? So that person has an image. And it's not for malice, right? No. They think that's happening in good faith, but the reality is it's not.
Yeah. So it's about being persistent about asking the question: are you really sure it's backed? Are you exercised
that's
to
exactly
see
right.
whether or not you would respond in the right way?
That's exactly right. It's that whole trust but verify. You said you did it. When's the last time you did it? How did it go? And if anybody tells you that it went perfectly, be suspicious. Right? And that's nothing against anybody. It's like me. Nowadays, cyber is so complicated and there's so many, all of us that's worked in this field, and I've talked to several people in this room about this, 15, 20 years ago, if you said I did cyber, we all could say you did this. You talk about cyber nowadays, it is so broad and so convoluted. If I walk in and tell you I got it, don't worry about it, fire me. Because I'm telling you, I don't got it all, right? You have to rely on a team of individuals that are broken up into different spaces. I constantly say it, trust but verify, and ask some questions. That doesn't mean micromanaging, but it means I'm engaged, and I want to know how it's going.
That's excellent. We were just observing earlier, it's like I've been working in this industry, I suppose, for about 20 years, and I've gone from computer and network security through to information security through to cyber security, as we're calling it now, and I'm quite inspired by. We've seen the term digital transformation crop up a lot, and we see that businesses are going, right, I want to do business a different way to disrupt my competitors, to create new markets, to do things at lower cost, faster, cheaper, better than ever before. But I'm taking all these risks without really realising what I'm doing. And still in my head, the IT department owns that risk. It's not a business risk. So it absolutely resonates with what you're saying.
That's right. Absolutely.
One of the things you talked about, Bob, was knowing your data. And then we also talk about the speed of business and acquisitions and your ever-expanding digital footprint. JC, what do you think organizations need to be doing when it comes to understanding and protecting their digital footprint?
I think it's super important. So I think, Bob, you were talking about people knowing where their data is, who's got access to that, what are the main business processes that are operating around it. I think a really important part of that is understanding, we use the term digital footprint to refer to all the data that is organisation has access to, but that could be seen from the outside. Having a digital footprint is a very positive thing if you can't do business without having a digital footprint these days. But knowing where the risks lie in that footprint is key. And we've been using the term digital shadow to refer to that. And if you can help me get that into the dictionary, Rick, I'll buy you a beer. But it's a really interesting concept, because being aware of who your organisation is and how it appears to outsiders from an exposure point of view, knowing what you're using to protect those key assets, and then looking at the threat environment around those key assets are all things that help speed up decision making, help you respond more effectively. And for me, that's really where if you don't have your hands around that, you're missing a really important part of the picture.
I totally agree with you, and to put it, and this is how complex this is nowadays, right? So you can take this off the scale in one direction when it talks to IT integration and all the different stuff we're wearing on the firewalls and how we're looking across their network and preparing this, but you could take it right down, again, back to the individual. I went into a company a few months ago that literally has 100 million records of healthcare information. And when I went into their space, which was totally secure, locks, guards, gates, nobody, every employee in the room had a cell phone. And every employee in the room is on the cell phone while they're going through hundreds and hundreds of thousands of persons' PHI, healthcare information, insurer information. And I asked a simple question. What's to stop anybody from taking a picture of this information and walking out with it? And everybody just stopped dead, right? So when you talk about digital footprint nowadays, we have to look at it in a very complex environment. Do you make a policy that no one's allowed to bring their cell phones in? I don't know the answer to that, but my point is, I think people pigeonhole it down into the IT information security, but when it's a much broader issue across the company, right? It's very complicated nowadays.
I think one of the things that inspired us to start our business was that we found a lot of IT security professionals sort of saying, well, you just shouldn't have a digital footprint at all. And that's just not realistic for any modern
totally
business,
agree.
right? So
Yeah.
we've got to get the conversation away from our stupid user, this whole sort of user bashing, sort of organisation doing dumb things sort of bashing thing, and actually say, look, what's the reality of the world we live in?
That's right.
How are you going to reduce these exposures? How are we actually going
That's
to
right.
practically work our way around these problems? Otherwise, we're just not going to get in a better place.
I totally agree.
So we know the threat landscape is overwhelming. We know our digital footprints are ever expanding. What are some of the controls that we can put in place, I would phrase it, to prevent what we can, but really fall back to detection and response there? So maybe what are some controls, technology controls, people things, legal things we can place? What are 2 or 3 things that you think organizations should do? And JC, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So I think for me, it's about being situationally aware as when you're thinking about the resilience of your business, being aware of what's going on around you. We look at that in sort of 3 main ways. So looking at the type of data loss that's occurring around your business, and a little bit like you were saying earlier, Bob, if someone tells you they're not experiencing data loss, ask them again until they find out the right answer, because all businesses have data loss in one form or another. Look at how identity is being disrupted around your business. Look at how people are impersonating or changing the way that your organisation is perceived for their interest rather than yours. And then look at the attack surface. Look at what you advertise online as your business. And it might not be your direct business. It might be one of your suppliers that represents you. So be aware of that as well. And the more of that you can measure, the more of that you can see, the more you can find the problems and fix them before they become real issues.
I agree. I threw out 3 key things in my opinion. CEO and board engagement, educate your people, 2-factor authentication. You do those 3 things, I think you've increased your risk model by 90%. Most companies hate 2-factor. Most consulting companies will lose it if you say we're going to slow business down because you need 2-factor. You need to bring that into your employee workload. After a couple months, nobody realizes they're doing it, but they're doing it. I think it would stop 60 to 70% of the breaches that I see, just because of the models we've talked about. So CEO, board engagement, educate your people on cyber risks, short, concise, relevant, and 2-factor authentication.
I want to dig into one area a little bit deeper on the CEO board engagement. A lot of our listeners are security practitioners, security leaders. Some of them are more risk focused than others. If I'm a security leader and I've been traditionally focused on security stack, the IT stack, I think in terms of that world, and I struggle with the business risk. I'll give you an example. Whenever I do talks, I always ask audiences who reads their Form 10Ks. Form 10K has a risk section in it, and it'll have 10 to 15 business risks that are out there. The majority of security practitioners asked that question have never once looked at a Form 10K. They've never listened in on one of their quarterly reports with the CEO on and the Wall Street analyst going through that sort of stuff. So if I'm struggling to kind of, I know that I need to make that step up to business risk away from like IT security risk. What guidance would you have for the practitioners and leaders that are struggling to kind of make that step over?
Yeah, I think one of the things is you got to make it worth their while. So what I mean by that, you can do it either through conversation or you can do it by influencing how they're rated throughout the company, right? The days of people understanding just what they do in the company are over. I call it, you got to get your head up and you got to see what's going on around you. It doesn't mean I need to understand or be the expert of another business model or different parts of the company that my business line is affecting, but I need to understand what's going on in there, especially for frontline leadership. The days of being able to sit in your office and run your 20 or 50 people or whatever you're doing are over. You need to have, and you either incorporate that in their annual review, the mid-year review, or whatever, they need to have an understanding of what's going around them in the company, right? It's not okay anymore for you to say, well, I don't do that. This is what I do. The bigger the organization, the more complex the organization, I think you need to have people with their head up understanding what's going on around them.
Good advice. Do you have any suggestions there, JC?
In terms of awareness, I think I really like the use of analogies, but done well. So if you can find a good analogy to help people sort of understand the challenges that you have in your daily role, sort of how you discover problems and then deliver them, actually use things like fire, other safety things like sort of fire prevention, for example, or medicine has some great analogies in it which can be quite helpful. I think for me, actually couching it in terms of things the business cares about, so revenue is probably the number one. If you're a business, it has to make money. How is that business making money going to be affected by some of these risks? That really does get people's attentions quite quickly. And I think also the availability piece, I found the relationship between cyber resilience and the availability of business to really capture people's attention. I found that quite a useful way to sort of, hey, have you considered what would happen if we lost this operation for a couple of hours? People very quickly get on top of that.
So speaking of fires, now the fire is going. Now we're in a response kind of stage. Bob, when Cyber Defense Labs goes in and gets the phone call that says, hey, the FBI told me this happened, or a third party has told them they've had an intrusion, what are some of the mistakes you see organizations making and what should they do?
Well, I think one of the things we talked about, they need to have a plan beforehand, and it needs to be well structured. And what I mean by that, look, if you've done one breach and you've done hundreds or thousands like I have, there's a cadence to these things. So the initial phone call is key. Usually these things start where you either get called by the insurer or the law firm, not necessarily the client, right, when a breach happens. And then there's an initial phone call within hours of a real breach. And on that phone call, there's some key people that need to be on it. You need an outside counsel's office, like I've said 100 times, that understands equities when it comes to cyber breach and your client's legal risk from the very beginning. Most, if not all of this, you need to do under privilege so that if there are lawsuits in the back end of this, it's protected. A lot of companies don't do that, and it opens them up to a tremendous amount of potential business risk. So you need a client, you need an outside counsel, you need the insurer most of the times, and then you need a breach response company, right? And from that point, whoever's in the company giving the initial readout on what's going on, whether that's IT, information security, physical security, or the part of the company that the breach they think actually happened, is key. Because within that period of time, within minutes if not hours, there'll be a statement of work done. People will immediately start logging into the systems of IT to figure out, one, do we still have an active threat? Is there people still in the network? Is there not? Did this happen 18 months ago or 24 months ago? And then the whole remediation phase. The other thing I will say, which is extremely important, most people don't do this. And as a head of a company, you need to figure out way in advance, if this is a significant breach or a significant ransomware attack where your systems are down for days, if not weeks, what's your internal message to your employees? And by the way, if your computer systems aren't working, how are you going to talk to them, right? What's your secondary and tertiary method of communicating with your employees? And let's talk about this. You got a company with 100,000 people in 40 different countries. That's a big deal. How do you do it? And by the way, you shouldn't be thinking about it at the same phone call that we're trying to figure out what's going on. that's what I'm talking about. When we talk about this stuff, it's legitimate, right? So as the head of a company, how am I messaging this to my employees? And then, by the way, how am I messaging it to my stockholders? And if I have to, how am I messaging it to my clients? Because the worst thing that's going to happen is all of a sudden there's a business interruption. A client starts calling people inside of your company. Your people in your company have no idea what's going on, and you see how this just snowballs. So when we talk about breaches, I would tell you that's the most significant things I see up front that I don't see people doing, and I would highly recommend that they have a short reaction plan to that on how they're going to do it. And then what happens if it goes more than a couple days or a couple weeks? What are you going to do for contingencies?
There's a really interesting bit that you sort of touched on there about looking at, in the immediate aftermath, trying to remove uncertainty from the process. Sort of some of that, what you were discussing there, talks about reduction of that uncertainty and making you look credible in at the point that when a response takes place. So I've looked at intelligence as a tool to reduce uncertainty. In your experience, Bob, when you look at breaches, do you find that intelligence has a role to play in helping organisations respond better and more effectively in that immediate aftermath?
I think it does, but I got to tell you what I have found, and again, this isn't for anybody because they're not smart, aggressive, great people. It's just that the speed of business and the amount of tasks everybody owns nowadays is overwhelming. So in most of these situations, everything that I've just discussed, that's not happening, right? What I usually see is the complete antithesis of that. On the initial phone call, you got senior leadership screaming at individuals in the company, not understanding what's going on. They don't understand what their cyber coverage actually covers. They don't know how they're going to pay payroll. They don't know how they're going to communicate to their employees. Now, you can see which way the stress model's going here, right? In no way, shape, or form is it, okay, we got this, we prepared for this, let's implement Plan X, and there'll be a bump or two in that, right? It always is. I can tell you from experience of running a lot of large-scale stuff around the world in the FBI, I don't care how tight of a plan you got, there's going to be a bump, something's going to go wrong, something's going to go off the rails. But if it's only one or two things versus everything that you're talking about, it's a big difference, right? So I think that's the key to this. And what people I don't think understand, and what I usually hear, and the teams at Cyber Defense Labs hear, is I don't know why are they attacking me? Why am I a target? And people don't understand that you're a target because they want revenue in some way from you. They want to extort you. They want to own your data. They don't really care. And in most cases, people don't realize, most attackers don't even know who they've hit on, right? Mm-hmm. So they don't know when they say, give me a $100,000 Bitcoin ransom. They don't know if you're a $100 million company or a $50,000 a year company. But the chaos that these attacks cause without this prior planning is the same. And unfortunately, I say it over and over and over again, I think bang for your buck, it costs the company almost nothing to do these things, but I just don't see it happening. I just don't.
So it's really about that preparation to reduce that uncertainty when things go wrong is the key.
You think about it. Let's take one of those examples. Okay, you got a company, let's not say it's a global company. You got 3,000 people and they're in 12 states. Okay, your computer system goes down, your payroll's tomorrow.
What are you going to do?
And well, by the way, how are you going to talk to everybody?
Yeah.
How are you going to tell them this is going on? You get where I'm going with this? How are you going to tell them you're not getting paid tomorrow? Or should they? Do you have a remediation plan that you know you can make payroll? I'm telling you, most companies aren't thinking about that. And so those discussions up front are a big deal. Because, by the way, when this is a legitimate, and we all know that most of the attacks that happen, these are not high-speed attack, nation-state attacks from China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. These are criminal organizations trying to make a buck. They could care less who you are. They just want to get paid, and most of the time they go away. And one of the things I will tell you, which has blown me away ever since I've come out of the FBI, and I'm not saying it won't happen, but in all the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of ransomware cases that I've handled, I've never seen one bad guy not give us the keys. And it blows me away. But it just shows you it's become a business. It's become a multi-trillion-dollar a year business. So people first are astounded, like, why am I a target? I'm a construction company in upstate New York. Why did they target me? Well, they didn't. They just necessarily knew that you had a vulnerability that they could exploit to potentially give them revenue. So people need to look at it different, is all I'm saying.
It's really interesting. We've been having one of our previous podcasts, Rick and I were discussing the things that frustrate us about people's breach responses, and one of them one of the topics being that they go, well, it's a really advanced attacker. We could not possibly have defended ourselves against it. It's quite interesting. In the proportion of the attacks that you see, you talk about the fact that they just own computers with people that use them is the main driver. Would you say like 80% are these opportunistic sort of attacks versus criminals gone out their way to target that specific business or that specific entity? What's the kind of ratios you're seeing in the responses?
I would say it's even higher than that. I think 90+% is, and let me caveat this, I don't think they're sophisticated attacks because they're not people that have actually done what we all think of when we think of traditional hacking into a company, moving laterally, obtaining credentials, locking off fire. That's not the way these attacks happen. But I will say the algorithms and the malware and the attacks that they can buy nowadays to launch are much more sophisticated than they were 5 years ago, right? So the actual bad guy, bad gal is not that sophisticated, but what they've allowed themselves to have access to through Tor routers, dark web, illicit websites on the internet is much more sophisticated. But overall, most of your attacks are email 365 compromises, they're traditional emails with some type of malware or virus on it, whether they're doing it through traditional attacks or advanced attacks. So it's not anything like you see on TV.
I think we've witnessed a lot of people now sort of scanning the internet looking for people whose computers are in not a good situation. So we saw this with the SMB protocol.
We see it with the honeypots that we run.
We run as well.
Sure.
We see it in spam traps as well. Just looking at so we run a couple of spam traps where we're receiving emails onto older domains and seeing what shows up in them.
Yeah.
And quite a lot of what we see tends to be something that happened in the last sort of 2 to 3 weeks in terms of weakness that the IT organisation hasn't quite caught up with in terms of protection, and then gets commoditised by criminals and then sort of becomes a toolkit which is then routinely
Well, it's
deployed.
that barrier to entry theme that's come up on both of the podcasts that we've done on this. The barrier to entry is getting lower and lower.
Yeah.
Tools are available that weren't available to the attackers, and then our digital footprints are ever expanding. We're coming towards the end of the podcast. I feel like we could go on and do a third and fourth session. Bob, it may not be a bad idea to have you come back in a year, and we can talk about how the threat think about how the threat landscape will have evolved in 1 year. Any final thoughts from each of you before we close out this podcast?
I think this has been a really interesting discussion. A couple of big takeaways for me about how we sort of talk about risk in organisations, but also like we look at all the businesses out there. Everyone's talking about advanced attacks versus opportunistic. I think we need to get these opportunistic threats under control. And actually, there's a vast amount of things to go out for most organisations there. So yeah, really interesting having this chat. Thank you.
No, great to be here. Glad to come back. I thought it was a great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll see you guys next time on Shadow Talk.